The reign of Louis XIV, the king so detested by Enlightenment philosophers for his absolutist regime, marked a golden age for France. His court at Versailles set the fashion for all of Europe, from styles of architecture to the shape of wigs. French was indeed a lingua franca, replacing Latin as the language of educated elites. In Prussia, the royal court spoke French rather than German. Farther east, in Russia, French became so dominant among the aristocracy that many nobles never even bothered to learn Russian, giving orders to Russian-speaking servants through a translator. But while French culture continued to dominate the 18th century world, French power did not. Trapped in an imperial rivalry with England, whose commercial prowess France ultimately failed to match, by the 1780s the nation teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. Though its ports were among the busiest in the world, France remained at its heart an agrarian economy. The nobility owned huge tracts of land, with peasants toiling in the same regions their ancestors had many centuries before. French society was divided into three estates. The clergy formed the first estate, followed by the nobility, and then the common people, who comprised 97% of the population. The first two estates possessed enormous privileges. The clergy were exempt from taxation, as was any land owned by the Catholic Church. Instead, the church annually provided a free gift, quote unquote, of 10% of its revenue. The nobility were also exempt from most taxes, including taxes on income and on land. This meant that the tax burden fell almost exclusively on the third estate, a category so large that it included the richest merchant and the poorest peasant. The third estate, lacking an assembly with tax-granting power, notably had no say in the taxes that were levied. This, as we've seen, was considered by many Enlightenment philosophers as the perfect recipe for tyranny. But with the kingdom's elites paying virtually nothing in taxes, the French state was chronically in financial trouble. It borrowed money at relatively high rates of interest, and the absence of a national bank prevented France from matching the financial prowesses of its European rivals, most of all Britain. France and Britain vied for supremacy across the 18th century. Louis XIV gave sanctuary to James II after his overthrow in 1688, fearing the implications of Parliament's victory over a king. France bankrolled the Jacobite movement, named Jacobite after Jacobus, the Latin for James, and France financed rebellions in Ireland and Scotland for the next 60 years. But it was the imperial rivalry that proved most costly for France. The two countries battled for control of America, India, and the Caribbean. France would ultimately lose these global conflicts. In 1763, at the conclusion of what was known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, and in America as the French and Indian War, France agreed to relinquish control over nearly all its territory in America. But the debt incurred by this conflict remained, augmented even further when France, seeking revenge for its defeat in the 7 Years' War, backed American rebels in their war for independence. With a little luck, the young King Louis XVI, who replaced his grandfather on the throne in 1774, might have weathered the storm. But a series of bad harvests throughout the 1780s, coupled with noble intransigence over any new taxes, proved to be his undoing. Louis was singularly ill-equipped to handle a nation in crisis. Chronically indecisive, Louis was said to agree with the last person he spoke with. He dismissed ministers at the slightest hint of opposition, providing little room for talented advisors to think their way out of any crisis. His court, though, remained as luxurious as ever, its prodigious spending a constant source of complaint among the overburdened members of the Third Estate. Louis's wife, Marie Antoinette, came under particular scorn. Her fondness for expensive diamonds and magnificent hairstyles earned her the title Madame Deficit. Added to this was a sense of indifference toward the struggling masses. While the queen never said, "let them eat cake," she did build an entire mock village at Versailles so that she and her friends could milk cows and pretend to be peasants. By 1786, the situation in France had become untenable. More than half the state's revenues were going towards servicing existing debts. Louis's finance minister, Charles de Calonne, proposed an overhaul of France's archaic tax system, together with the imposition of a general land tax. Louis gathered together an assembly of notables, a selection of France's elite, to approve these taxes, but the assembly declined to do so. Only an Estates General, a legislative body of all three estates, could in their view legally revoke the long-standing privileges of the nobility. After 2 years of delay, and faced with no other option, Louis called an Estates General to be held in the summer of 1789. The Estates General was a medieval institution. Representatives from all three estates were to gather together and vote on the kingdom's finances. But it had not met since 1614 and was in no way actually a representative of the kingdom. As a body, the Estates General was heavily tilted toward the elite. Each estate only received one vote, so the nobility and the clergy could block any initiative from the members of the Third Estate. Moreover, the three estates were obliged to meet separately. This meant that the Estates General was unlikely to ever agree to revoke any privileges, which sort of defeated the whole purpose of the meeting. This was unacceptable to many Third Estate delegates who were determined to take their rightful place as representatives, as they saw it, of the nation. They demanded that each representative be seated individually rather than as separate estates, with legislation passed only by majority vote. They were led by a priest named Abbé Sieyès, who stood for election under the Third Estate rather than the First, and who wrote a treatise entitled "What is the Third Estate?" He posed a series of questions. First, what is the Third Estate? He answered, everything. What does it possess? He answered, nothing. What does it want? Sieyès answered, to become something. Third Estate representatives came with lists of grievances, entitled Cahiers de doléances, which they believed the government had a duty to redress. But since representatives from the Third Estate formed a majority of the actual delegates who showed up in Versailles, the nobility and the clergy balked at agreeing to majority rule, since that would have been tantamount to surrendering their power. Rather than accept their reservations, the Third Estate proceeded to take matters into its own hands. They declared themselves to be the National Assembly and invited members of the other two estates to join. More than 100 clergy joined, as did a handful of nobles, including the Marquis de Lafayette, George Washington's protege during the American Revolution. Fearing unrest, Louis XVI moved to dismiss the entire Estates General, but the new National Assembly would not allow that either. Members gathered in a royal tennis court and swore what became known as the Tennis Court Oath, swearing never to leave Versailles until the National Assembly had adopted a new constitution. Louis had no choice but to back down. In August, the National Assembly proclaimed a new Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which proclaimed the Revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It declared that men are born free and remain equal in rights. But the high ideals of this revolutionary moment would soon be overtaken by events. It's no surprise that while the Declaration of the Rights of Man remains an iconic symbol of the revolution, so too is the guillotine. As members of the three estates gathered in Versailles that summer of 1789, what came to be known as the Great Fear erupted across the French countryside. Disgruntled peasants killed their landlords and ransacked the lavish estates upon which they were compelled to work. And in Paris, a mob mainly comprised of urban workers, on July 14th attacked the Bastille prison, the hated symbol of royal authority in the city. A violent revolution had begun that would not abate for about 10 years.